welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read books and other words too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah, and I am so thrilled that today we are talking with Leslye Penelope about her latest standalone novel, The Monsters We Defy.
Thank y'all for having me.
Yeah, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for coming on to talk to us.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
So are we.
Well, before we jump into our conversation about this very excellent book that I loved to pieces, spoiler, that's going to be what most of this conversation is. What's something great that happened this week?
This week, I was really excited to get back on schedule. I have 2 different deadlines for upcoming books. And as soon as I made my schedule, I was immediately off schedule. I already fell behind. So I spent a week trying to get back, which just makes me feel better. It makes me feel a little bit more confident about actually being able to write these books in the time that is allotted to me.
Well, congratulations.
Thanks.
That's very exciting. My good thing is very simple in that it's sunny out today. Probably not warm. I doubt that it is warm, but we've had some pretty crazy storms for the last couple of days in Seattle with like ridiculous winds and stuff. So having just a calm, sunny winter day is a nice change.
It is a nice change of pace. My good thing is that Mr. Squeak, one of my pugs, turned 7 yesterday. So she's officially a senior dog.
Happy birthday, Mr. Squeak.
Happy birthday.
Yeah. She still thinks she's a puppy, but
They always are.
Yeah.
I mean, she is still a puppy. A puppy at heart. Yes, exactly.
Well, what is everyone drinking this lovely afternoon for me? Leslye, you're in a different time zone, aren't you?
I'm on the East Coast, so it is, yes, afternoon. I have lemon ginger tea, which is one of my favorite afternoon teas.
That sounds delicious. I also have herbal tea, but I'm drinking sleepy time tea. I know. Has anyone big as big of a rebel as I?
Will you be able to stay awake through the entire podcast?
Oh, the adrenaline high of talking to you about this book will carry me through.
I also have a tea that is supposed to aid with sleep. It's a toasted brown rice tea. Quite lovely. I don't think that it's particularly sleep-inducing, but it's nice and calming.
That's a really savory one, isn't it?
Yeah, it's more on the savory side.
That's
it
nice.
Also has some like dried shiitake mushrooms in it.
Like a whole meal. It's a soup.
Yeah. I don't really taste the mushroom, but maybe it gives it a little additional earthiness.
Yeah.
Well, it's very fancy. Has anyone read anything good lately, other than, of course, the book that we're about to talk about for roughly an hour?
My favorite recent read was The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy by Megan Bannon.
I've heard of that. I haven't read it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I am so in love with it. I'm thinking of reading it again. It's so magical. It's a romance. It takes place in a really interesting world that she's created. And, there's family drama. There's just like a really that kind of how are they going to get out of this situation type of romance. And I just adored it.
I might have to bump that up on my TBR then.
Yeah.
Well, Ms. Penelope, not only is there a published interview in the back of this book, but you have discussed this book on your own podcast. So some of the questions we ask might be pretty similar, but we promise we didn't copy anything exactly. I say we have a 50% chance of asking you something new.
Hey.
Hopefully there's at least 1 or 2 questions that you haven't answered yet.
You'll stump me. I'll be like,
Speaking of your podcast, which is My Imaginary Friends.
Yes, My Imaginary Friends.
Which is about, I believe it's a behind-the-scenes look at the writing process.
Right.
And I was wondering if over the course of running a podcast, has it changed your process at all just by virtue of reflecting on it in this format?
I think so. I mean, one of the reasons I originally started podcasting was to replace blogging. And I just thought it would be easier to speak than to write because it would take me hours to write a blog post, probably because I'm a perfectionist, but I can let that go a little if I'm just talking about it. And I also forget. So, I'll be talking with my friends. Like I meet with other writers and they'll be like, oh, Leslye, you're in this, you're in this really difficult part in the middle and you're not sure what's happening. That happened in the last book and in the book after that. I remember 2 years ago, you were complaining about the exact same things. And so by talking about it on the podcast, I can articulate the process and it helps me just be more comfortable with the hard parts of writing and knowing that I have gone through it before and I figured it out every other time. So chances are really good that I'm going to figure out this problem or whatever is happening. And also just to have a record of it. And also I think it helps other people. I hear from other people who are listeners. I've learned something from my process. And I think we're always learning from each other. I love hearing about other authors' process, and how they write and how they solve their problems too. So it helps me figure out what I'm doing and just giving me that confidence that no matter how bad it seems in the trenches, that I'm pretty sure I can get out of it.
That's fantastic.
Do you find yourself going back to episodes that you've previously recorded to maybe get ideas on how to get out of an issue that you find yourself in?
Yeah, sometimes I will re-listen to certain things, and exactly that, just to have that feeling of comfort, okay, I can do this. I've got this, I listen to myself talking about it.
It's been worse.
Right. Yeah. It's been at least as bad, if not worse before.
Well, speaking of your process, how much do you plan when you write?
I'm a plotter. So I have to plan, I have to know basically the skeleton of the story. I still discover most things when I'm actually doing the writing. But before I sit down and do a first draft, I have a pretty detailed outline. Usually I have a synopsis where I try to sort of live through the book in brief. So if I'm writing a full-length novel, somewhere between 80 to 100,000 words, my synopsis might be 12 to 15 pages. And then I try to do a paragraph per chapter or per scene. And that gets me, so far. It gets me into the book. It gets me about to the midpoint. And usually once I've in the draft gotten to the midpoint, everything changes. Everything I planned is wrong all of a sudden. But doing the planning up front helps me be able just to move forward. And it also is really good because I know I've got the building blocks of what I need to change when I discover that everything has gone wrong.
I was really interested to see in the bio that's included in the Monsters We Defy that you have a degree in computer science. I work as a software developer, so I'm always interested. Nice. It always makes me happy when an author has that background, just because I'm oh, we have something a little bit in common. How, if at all, do you find your background in computer science informs your writing?
So I have a degree in film production and I minored in computer science. So it's got two different parts of my brain, but I do sometimes think of putting together a plot, putting together a story like coding, and especially troubleshooting. Mm-hmm. I heard someone talk about plotting as being 3D chess. And that's how I also feel about coding sometimes. So when I'm going through that process of starting a revision, let's say, I've got a full first draft, but I know that there are things I'm not happy with and I really want to punch up certain things or fix things that are broken, then it's kind of like QA testing and troubleshooting to see, okay, how do I figure out what exactly is wrong? How do I analyze this entire story and then figure out how to change it? And that is very similar to how I approach, if I'm building a plugin. I'm a website developer by day. And so I'll do, a plugin or some other function that I'm writing and scripting. And it seems like it's a very similar process for my brain to go through to do that and to come up with a complicated or a plot twist or something that hopefully the reader doesn't see coming,
Well, there were a couple of those, or at least things that surprised me in the Monsters We Defy.
Good.
This book is set in the 1920s. There are ghosts, so we debated on whether this would count as, it's fantasy, but the setting is not super fantasy. I threw out the phrase urban fantasy because it is technically in a city, but that sure is not the right vibe.
Yeah, I don't think it feels like urban fantasy.
But technically those words work.
Right. Technically they do, yes.
I don't know if you knew this, but you actually wrote this book for me.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, me too. I'm such a like trash fan of the 1920s. So this like checked all of my boxes. I loved every second of it.
Oh, nice. I became a fan of the 20s during the research of this.
Good. I'm glad. We've got you on our side now. It's just such a ridiculous time period with so much really awful stuff.
Yeah. It's just the awful mixed with, the spectacular. People think of like the Jazz Age. I remember when I was writing it and I would say, I'm writing a story that takes place in 1925. And they're like, oh, the Jazz Age. And I was like, I guess it was the Jazz Age, but I didn't think about it that way because that's not really what my story is about. And there's so much else happening in the 20s. There were all these extremes that were in the culture. And that makes it also a really interesting time period.
I agree. I think that combination of the glamour with the almost horror of human experience that happened in that time period and like that weird layering is what makes that time period so interesting to me. And we do get a lot of that because it turns out being Black in Washington, D.C. in 1925 wasn't super great.
Just like a lot of other places. Yeah.
Well, yes. Specifically in the book, though, is set in Washington, D.C., not a place that I'm familiar with at all. So getting to explore the city a little bit, even in a fiction novel, was very fun. But you are very familiar with it, is my understanding.
Yes, I grew up mostly outside of Maryland. I mean, mostly in Maryland, outside of DC. My mother's side of the family is from Washington, DC. I went to Howard University, so I lived in the city when I was in college and afterwards. So yeah, and I'm really familiar with the specific neighborhood that I talk about in the book, because basically the book takes place in a really small, concentrated neighborhood, U Street, and it's called Shaw right now. They renamed it Shaw in the 60s, and it was an all-Black community. And so it was kind of decimated in the 60s during the riots. And I was, in college in the late 90s, and it had been built up. It's gone through a lot over the years, but seeing the differences was really interesting, and doing all the research about what it was then and how vibrant a community it was. Because even though life for Black people, it was very difficult in the 20s and for many years before and after, there were pockets of places where they were thriving. And this is one of those places. It was a Black community where, all the stores were, or many of the stores were Black owned, and people owned their homes, and, different classes kind of mingled. There were all kinds of things happening. And I just wanted to explore that part of it too.
How did you balance the historical accuracy with the story that you wanted to tell? I mean, you did quite a bit of research. You list some of your sources in the end of the book, which was really interesting. I always love seeing that.
Yeah, I was excited to do an author's note, to get the chance to have one of these author's notes, because I love them too when I read books, like historical books. So for me, I took a great pains to make it as historically accurate as possible, considering there are ghosts and magic in the story. Like everything else, the vast majority of any place I name is a real place. And I found out as much as I could about it. I made maps so that I could virtually walk down the street and know what I was passing by, and listing out the businesses that were along the streets and things like that. Because I wanted to bring the real city to life, and then ground, even the magic is grounded in, real African-American folk magic, things like hoodoo and conjure, root work. It has different names in different places. So it is a fantasy, but it's also very historically accurate. There are real people, real historical figures, like Langston Hughes, and other people who come into the book and are characters. And I had a lot of fun with that too. And so, yeah, my task that I gave myself was to make it as accurate as possible, and then layer this story on top of it with all of the fantasy elements that I really enjoy reading about as well.
I was blown away to find out that Clara, our main character, was based on a real person. That was amazing.
Yeah, when I found her, it's like I started finding the story, because I was looking, I wanted to write a Harlem Renaissance era fantasy heist. And I didn't know anything else. I didn't have any characters. I didn't know what they were stealing. I decided at first it was actually going to be in Harlem. And then I was like, no, I'm writing about DC. I'm my family from DC. I've lived in DC, and I don't read enough books about DC. And so during that research, I found the real Clara Johnson, who was a real person. And I could tell her story, the real version, in the author's note. And just imagining how this character, this real person would have been. So in the Red Summer riots of 1919, she was 17 years old. And it's a story that reminded me a lot of the Breonna Taylor story from 2020, 100 years later, where she was in her bedroom, and during this riot, police, burst into her bedroom and start shooting. She actually shoots back. She kills one of the officers who comes into her home and is arrested and charged with manslaughter, and actually convicted, and then gets off later on, which was amazing in and of itself. Her whole story, being 17, being the only person during, 4 days of extreme violence, the only one to be convicted of killing anybody, and, getting out of that situation. And just once I read this Washington Post article about the riots and about her, I was just thinking, who was she? I was so curious about her as a person, and my imagination, created this version of her for this story. And just her personality, everything is based on how someone who, if that happened to you when you were 17, how do you look, 5-6 years later, once you've gotten out of jail, trying to get your life back together, and add in magic on top of that. You are also a psychic. You're also a clairvoyant person who has, made a very difficult deal with the spirit. Like all of those things just kind of piled onto each other, onto this real life person. And I thought that it was just a really interesting story to tell.
Absolutely.
Something else about this book that I really enjoyed was how strong the narrative voice was. I mean, it wasn't in first person point of view, it was in third person, but the narrator still felt like they had a lot of character, even though they weren't a person. That actually reminded me quite a bit of Lord of the Rings in that sense.
Oh, interesting.
Not that there's a lot of technical overlap between these two works.
The style is very different, but
yeah,
that sense of character, I think, is similar between the two. Different character, but
yeah. Well, it's extremely high praise. Thank you. I did want the narrative voice to feel like its own character. So there's the third person narrator for Clara's sections, and then there's sort of these interstitials that are told in more of like a collective voice. And I had a lot of inspiration for that. There's a book called Mama Day by Gloria Naylor, which is one of my favorite books growing up. And it takes place on an island off the coast of Georgia. And you feel like the island has a voice and is telling you its story. And I wanted sort of the city of Washington, D.C. to be telling part of the story, and interspersed with Clara, who is a very specific kind of character. And I think she herself has a strong voice also. So that was something that was really important to me in terms of the storytelling. Like, how am I going to make that happen? How do I make the city feel a little bit like a character, and imbue it with like the rich history that I had discovered, and just make it feel really vibrant.
Absolutely. It gave the whole book such a deep sense of, I'm going to say place, but I mean time. I did have a moment, and this is just me making fun of myself, where I suddenly thought it had slipped into the second person, and then I realized that no, the chapter was starting with dialogue. I just didn't realize that. Anyway, that took like a half a second sentence to figure out, but that was still a moment of, whoa, didn't see that coming.
Second person can be fun to play with. I've done that in other books and had a lot of fun with that. But I think used sparingly, it can be really great.
Yeah. I believe this is the first book you've published since the Earthsinger Chronicles.
It's the first traditionally published book. I am hybrid, so I had a self-published book that was in between them called Savage City. But yes, this is the first book with Orbit, and it's the first traditional published book since then.
But not the first book you've written since then.
Right.
Okay. But I mean, Earthsinger Chronicles is a huge series, and we were kind of wondering what considerations you take into account writing a series versus a standalone story.
It was really refreshing to write a standalone. I have had lots of feedback of people who want a sequel to the Monsters We Defy, but as of now, it was written as a standalone. And yes, with Earthsinger Chronicles being, 4 novels, 3 novellas, it's a longer series, it felt like when I first wrote Song of Blood and Stone, which is book 1 of the Earthsinger Chronicles, it was the first novel I'd ever completed. It was my first published book. And I don't remember why I thought, oh, this has to be 4 books. Like I was like, at the end of writing the first one, I'm like, yeah, no, this story is going to take 4 books to tell. And I was very confident about that. And, fast forward to me actually writing the 4th book, when at one point I thought I was going to have to make it 5 books. And I'm like, oh, no, nobody wants that. We're going to end it here. It just, some stories feel bigger, I guess, even though that series is sort of self-contained. I tried to make it romantic fantasy with a different couple per book, which kind of worked, kind of didn't work. But there's an overarching story that I knew was just going to take me time to tell because it was so big. It encompassed countries and, different people and races and bigger magic systems and things like that. This story just felt smaller. So yeah, thinking about a series, it's like if you have that idea that what you're grappling with is just like a larger tale, and sometimes you're going to know exactly how long, 4 books. And then I added the 3 novellas. The novellas were always part of the plan, but they were always like optional reading. But sometimes you're not going to know. And I haven't ever had the occasion to write like a series where it's going to be ongoing and I don't know how it's going to end, because I think just the way my brain works, it's like there's a story that has to be told. I don't know, like when I started the first book of Earthsinger, I didn't know all of the details of every part of the story, but I knew where it was going to end. I just intuitively felt, okay, it's going to take me this long to get there. These are going to be the kind of the branches and the paths that it's going to take. So Yeah, sometimes people ask about like, oh, did you plot, the whole thing ahead of time? Did you know everything that was going to happen? Absolutely not. I had like a vague notion of like 3 or 4 bullet points for each of the main books, and that was it. But I did know how I wanted to come to a conclusion. And yeah, bringing that to a close was really satisfying, but it was also very exhausting. So the idea of doing some standalones afterwards was like, yes, I'm really excited about that.
A nice change of pace, I imagine.
Definitely.
Well, I can't wait to talk about the romance in this book because it was so much fun, that plot line and the tension of that. But I think we're going to save that for the spoiler section. So before we get there, Sarah, why should you read this book?
You should read this book if you like historical fiction, but want just a little bit of fantasy in it. If you're a fan of the 1920s, obviously. If you want a fun heist novel with great characters and a distinct voice, you should absolutely read this book.
It's got ghosts and romance.
What more could you want?
Right? Something for everyone.
Exactly.
To avoid spoilers, skip to 4157.
And now we're in the spoiler section. We can talk about whatever we want, including Israel.
Israel. Yay.
Oh my goodness. The introduction of Israel was so much fun. The mysterious stranger and the conflict between him and Clara was absolutely delicious, especially with all of the really enjoyable appreciation of the male form, I will call it, in this book. Fun is really just the best word for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I'd done more romancy stuff, and I knew this was not going to be a romance, but I really wanted to have that love story in there and that romantic tension, just that kind of same energy without all of the focus being on, will these two people get together? So adding in like a little bit of that tension and keeping it light, but also grounding it in Clara's perspective where she doesn't really want to be attracted to him. She's kind of fighting it. She's a little bit of an acerbic character. So she's going to go kicking and screaming into any kind of relationship.
But it was also really nice seeing Clara's development, like personal growth through the relationship, in the sense that she starts off very, understandably hardened and kind of in a shell. And so to see her grow out of that and expand and start this relationship was also very satisfying.
I love love stories, and I love kind of people falling in love even when they're fighting it. And it's more fun to write when they're fighting it. So it wasn't actually that very difficult to do. I think it came naturally because of these two characters. And I liked trying to figure out, okay, why what is it about each of them that they like? And how do I see that in there without having to be too overt about it?
We got a couple of other little bonus romances as well, although they didn't get as much page time.
Zelda! I loved her romance.
I loved everything about Zelda.
Yes, that too.
Zelda is the best. I love Zelda so much.
What a good friend. Even when Clara insisted they weren't friends, that was so funny. I like, not slapstick funny, but just absolutely hilarious. Their dynamic at the beginning of the novel, and then Clara finally accepting that she does have friends.
It's like the ride or die. Zelda is your ride or die. Like, even if you don't want to be her friend, she doesn't care. She's just that confident. And, she's a great person to have on your side.
And Clara won her, not respect, but that alliance, right? By getting her out of a tough situation when they met. So it never felt undeserved.
Mm-hmm.
Even if she pretended that they weren't friends.
Yeah, Zelda saw through the mask, like that first action, helping her get away from that teenage gangster was all she needed to know. Like, I think she deals in absolutes and not what people are portraying to the world. So yeah, she could see through everything.
There was another character, Aristotle, who had a absolutely heartbreaking romance. I guess the romance wasn't heartbreaking, but their situation was, because he was always... I guess we should probably explain charms and tricks, although this is the spoiler section, so the listeners theoretically know that already.
But in case you don't know that, a charm is basically you go to these enigmas, these spirits, they will grant you a gift, but it always comes with a price, and it's never exactly like, it's not fulfilled in the way that you think it will be. It's not necessarily a good thing, or it's never a good thing. And so the trick is the bad aspect of it.
And Aristotle, wanted to be the best actor, but then the drawback was that he could never be himself. And so even though there was this character that he got along well with, it wasn't really him. But then at the end, I assume that everything worked out well between them. You don't say that it didn't at the end of the book, so I'm just taking that for myself.
Yes. It's intimated that, once they resolve everything and Aristotle's able to be himself, he goes back and they can start their relationship for real, like with each other.
And I like to think that they live happily ever after for a very long time.
Absolutely. Of course. I'm a romance lover at heart. So yes, they're going to have their HEA.
Yes.
It did strike me while I was reading this book that Aristotle's charm could stand as a metaphor for being in the closet, since he is a gay man in the 1920s, weird time. But the idea that you do have to put on a front and be someone else in public. And so that I thought was a very interesting and very well done.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. I think that subconsciously, thinking about that character, I wanted an actor, I wanted someone in vaudeville. And I was actually fascinated with the idea that Black characters had to still put on blackface. And that's just mentioned briefly, but that was something that it was just weird to me, as it's just a weird thing. But when I was doing research and I found the evidence of like the drag balls that were happening all the way back in the late 1800s, there's news articles of raids, and in DC, there was a former slave who was putting on parties for gay men. And I think some of them were in drag, some weren't, but back in the 1800s. So, and then in the 1930s in Harlem, there was really well documented drag balls. And that's something that not everybody knows about. So this community was there, everybody would come out to them, not just, gay people or people in the community. It was just people would come probably to stare at these oddities, but also people to celebrate them to a certain degree too. There's just all kinds of things happening. As much oppression as different groups underwent at that time, there was still community and there was still acceptance and levels of acceptance from certain people. But yeah, they had to hide because there were laws, of course, and just regular discrimination. So being an actor, having to hide, being able to disappear, being able to literally transform yourself into anyone else. It could be a metaphor for just being in the closet or for being trans or just having to portray something that wasn't your real self. And then having that freedom at the end, finally, to just be who you are. It's always wonderful.
So we talked a little bit about charms and tricks. What trick, in your opinion, is the saddest? I think for me, that was definitely Jesse Lee being forgotten by Daisy. When you said that was his trick, I was like, oh no.
Like literally every time I had to read that section, and I read the book dozens of times, I would tear up at Jesse Lee's section. That made me the saddest when I was writing it, whenever I read it. So yeah, Jesse Lee is just heartbreaking to me, that whole situation.
Yeah, it was just heartbreaking. And the way that he goes on all of these first dates with her, but she doesn't remember them at all. Oh, it was, it was so sad.
Yeah, like Isolde is my favorite character, but I loved all the characters. But like Jesse Lee has also a special place in my heart because of that. He does his deal with the Enigma to try to help his PTSD from being in the war. And all of that seems like, sometimes it's noble goals that they're trying to do, and sometimes it's not so noble. But I feel like he was trying to really fix himself, or to his mind, and to be saddled with that. The tricks are hard. They're supposed to be hard, and they're the consequences for the magic can be really tough. And I think that's that trade-off that makes that magic system really interesting.
Definitely. Were there any charms and tricks that you came up with that you liked but didn't have the opportunity to use in the novel?
I'm sure there were. I don't know if I remember. I kind of went through a list of, okay, what are some things people like, just powers? There's superpower wikis and stuff like that. Or like, what is something that I haven't thought of before, trying to just find something a little bit different. And then once I started learning more about the characters and figuring out what they would actually ask for from an enigma, that helped me figure out, okay, what's the backlash of that? What is the equal and opposite reaction that could be generated, or that the enigma might think was funny or ironic, or however enigmas think. I listed out a bunch of things. I don't remember what they were now, but like, invisibility, is that cool? Like, is that what we want? Should they be able to fly? Like, I just went crazy, and I was like, well, I want it a little more grounded. But at a certain point, I just like brainstorm anything and then try to fit it to the character.
I bet there is someone in this world who has, I don't know, can fly, but can only fly or something.
Yeah, they can't walk anymore.
Yeah.
Like, that's the trick, right? Yeah.
I'm sure someone asked for that. Yeah.
The tricks are also kind of hard to come up with. Like, okay, what's going to be a thing that's bad that maybe you can still live normally-ish, but is bad enough that you really want to get rid of it.
Well, the enigmas are sort of understood from the very beginning to not have humans' best interests at heart. But there's another sort of supernatural entity that we see called the Greys, who start out as a sinister presence, but they ultimately end up being benevolent. Did make me cry. And I was just wondering, I guess you already mentioned that this was based in folklore, but all of the different supernatural forces were very cool.
Yeah, the Greys, not so much. I mean, I based the enigmas. I'm trying to think. Like, there's different. I had been researching voodoo, and kind of the different entities, and their basis in West African deities, and how those, because of the slave trade, there's certain deities that you can trace back, but they change a lot depending on where we go, and whether it's voodoo or candomblé or the Southern American folk magic. They have the same roots in these characters, but they're very different. And so I just kind of threw all that in a pot and created these entities. But yeah, the Greys is just a way of thinking about populating this spirit world with, okay, what are the paranormal things that we're more familiar with, like ghost sightings or people who believe their house is haunted and something's happening. That's not necessarily an enigma, but it's something over there. It's some other spiritual entity. So there's a variety of them. And maybe, we don't even know what they all are, what they want. And sometimes they might be benevolent and other times not so much. And who knows why? It's just like Clara might, because she's clairvoyant. But like if she chose to like focus on her abilities, her naturally born abilities, maybe she would have more information. Their world is just as vibrant and full of different types of beings as our world is.
Something I noticed, and maybe I'm reading too far into it, was that both Israel and Clara had absentee mothers, which is not something we see a lot in media. And maybe that's just part of the stereotype of motherhood in popular culture. But then there is also that fantasy trope where characters don't have their parents, but that's never the parents' choice, right? So we have a very different version of that in this book. And I just thought it was interesting that both of these characters had experienced that. Once is something, twice is a coincidence. There's that saying. I've messed that up.
Once is happenstance, twice is a coincidence, three times is enemy action, I think is the phrase.
Well, I'm skipping straight to the third one.
But there weren't three. There were only two.
I think there's a lot of kind of family issues. And I took that just from the reality of history and, things I found in research or things that I've just observed in terms of, we have the Black migration from the South to the North that happened during this time. And Black family has been under a lot of stress for, generations. Like during slavery, it was always torn apart. And then even afterwards, there were all of these different stressors. So there can be, whole Black families, but there's a lot of like infant mortality that happens during this time period because of medical care and all of that. And I just imagine people wanting different things. And so coming from having fewer choices in the South, if they were sharecropping or something like that, to coming north and thinking it was a world of possibilities and how would that affect motherhood in different ways. And fatherhood and just children, like the whole thing. There's lots of different kinds of families in the story and different tragic stories about families. Zelda's mother sold her to the circus, essentially. So she didn't have a great mother either. Although, like, I tried to paint them as human beings with dilemmas. There were 12 of them or something. Yeah. So I don't know if it was necessarily conscious. It was just kind of came out of that idea that it's going to be really conflicted. And each of these characters had these kind of backstories and wounds of what made them into who they are. And your mother and your parents and your family and your childhood are so important to that when you're creating a fictional character as a writer, that you always throw, difficult circumstances at the characters. And it gave Israel and Clara something in common that they both have these difficult relationships or had, mothers who abandoned them to different degrees. And that was another thing that was in the column of why they're perfect for each other also.
Mhm.
I felt really bad for Clara for being able to see her mother with another man, like in that other man's bedroom with her psychic powers. That I feel like that would be very scarring for a young girl.
Absolutely. Yeah. I kind of tried to imagine what, if she could see anything and couldn't control it. I mean, she's seeing anything. So there are a lot of scarring images there that is one of the reasons she had to block everything out and makes her even more closed off and hardened. That shell was created from a lot of different, sources.
Understandable.
I did like seeing, I think Clara's mother is the first skeptic we see. And that was something I had been very curious about. And it's always an interesting thing to explore in a world where there is supernatural power. What about the people who don't believe in that?
Right.
And how does that stand up to where there's more proof than perhaps there is in our world?
I mean, yeah, like the people who believe in our world are not swayed by the skeptics.
Mhm.
So even though there's probably more skeptics, I envision it as basically our world and this hidden layer underneath.
Mhm.
And there are enough people across cultures who believe in the folklore, the mysticism of their culture, that I think it makes sense. Like maybe most of us don't, but there's tales my grandmother used to tell. Like I don't know to what extent she believed anything, but she certainly told us about things and warned us off certain behavior because of these vaguely supernatural reasons. So yeah, there's magic all around us if you choose to see it, and it's easy not to, but I think it's also easy to see it.
I mean, everyone always thinks highly of themselves, right? And I think, well, if I lived in a world where there was magic, of course I would believe it because it would be real and true. But that's not necessarily the case,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy to deny. Like it's easy to be a rationalist, I think.
Especially, I mean, Clara's mother having to deal with her child going through these very traumatic experiences and not knowing how to help her.
Right.
I think you described it very well. All of the characters are human making difficult choices and not necessarily the best choice, but still understandable why they do the actions they do.
Yeah.
Earlier, we asked you a little bit about your process, and you talked about being a plotter and having a general plan for the direction of your book. And we were wondering, how different is this final product from the first draft or from your first concept?
There was a quote that a writing teacher told me, and I don't know who originally said it, but the quote is something like, "From the first draft to the last draft, not a word remains." So it's the general story is there, but how I get to it changes a lot. And because my first drafts are written very fast, like I don't do any editing, I don't reread anything. I just try to get it out literally as quickly as I can in the shortest number of days as possible, just so I can dump the idea out. And then I have something to fix. It's like having this clay, like you don't have the clay before. I don't know how you get clay. You dig it up or something. The metaphor falls apart. But like whatever you do to acquire the clay, then you have it and you can make something cool out of it. So yeah, there's lots of changes. I know the spine, like I know like there's a couple of core things. There might be a few core scenes that I'm really clear on that stay, but character motivations, sometimes personalities change. Like my current work in progress, I'm in the middle of trying to figure out how to drastically shift the personality of one of my main characters because it just wasn't working. He was too nice, I often start out making things really easy for the characters, and then I have to layer on the complications and put them through the ringer because that's part of what makes a good story. But my first inclination is just like, I love these people. I don't want anything bad to happen to them. Everything will be fine. So that's the iteration of the different drafts and my revisions, which are pretty intense.
Were there any scenes that surprised you as you wrote them? Like you hadn't envisioned things turning out that way and suddenly this was the scene you were writing?
Yeah, definitely. I think that kind of the middle of the novel where they're in the garage and Clara and Israel have snuck in, weird decision. Like Israel's like, "Are you sure you want to do this? This is crazy." That scene, I don't think I knew even that Josephine was going to show up. Like I just knew they were going to go, it's going to be bad, something's going to happen, and then they'll leave somehow. It's kind of like, I know the beginning and the end. What happens in the middle? is all discovery as I'm typing. Literally, it's just as I'm typing, things are coming into my head and I just let them come. And so I had to kind of go back and make all of this make sense. And then another pass, I layered in the grays coming in that scene. And that came in a little bit later as I'm trying to increase the tension. So things like that definitely happen. I think at the end, when Aristotle takes on the form of W.E.B. Du Bois, that was a surprise to me too. I was like, something else has to happen here. He's got to use his power. They're not going to let them in. They need another complication. Oh, wait. Okay, let's bring in the super famous, celebrity who everybody would be amazed and would just distract everybody. So that kind of stuff was just like really fun, like because I'd done all this research and I wanted to keep, putting in these little Easter eggs of real historical figures. That came to me and I was like, oh, I love it. I like it. Let's do it. It stays.
It was excellent. I really enjoyed that scene too.
Thanks.
It brought up so many questions for me with or maybe not questions, but that's not something you can do in an internet age or a social media age, right?
Right. True.
I just kept thinking what if the real W.E.B. Du Bois shows up? Or what if someone asks him about this later and he doesn't know about it?
Yeah, I was definitely thinking, is this going to get back to him? Is he going to hear that he was at this event and be really confused?
Like the origin of deja vu or something.
Yeah.
There were no paparazzi to blow their cover, though. So they're,
Exactly.
Good use of the time period on their part. Well, for as much as you put the characters through the ringer, I would say they all have pretty optimistic endings, which I appreciated.
Yeah, that's important to me. I like to leave you on a high note. The books that kind of end down, they just for me, sometimes they can be fascinating and really interesting, but I want to end up and I want to end with hope for everyone. So you can if someone wants to do some headcanon about how their happily ever afters work out and look, that's great. But yeah, just give you that seed that things are going to be okay now. We've put them through a lot and they're good.
I definitely appreciate that. I find that the world is, grim enough as it is. I want my books to be happy, at least in the end. Obviously the characters are going to go through some struggle. Otherwise it wouldn't necessarily be that compelling of a novel. But I want there to be that nugget of hope, like you said.
Yeah, it's all about hope.
One thing that I just cannot wrap my brain around is the use of the word heifer in a derogatory way, but a playful one by Clara and Zelda to refer to other women and I think each other at some points.
Right.
In the way that, with my friends, I would use the word bitch and not think twice.
Mm-hmm.
But for some reason, heifer just curdles my stomach. I cannot explain why that's so upsetting to me.
I find that so strange.
Yeah, it's an old-fashioned word. I remember my grandmother calling us heifers, honestly, because it's something that was much more common back in the day. So maybe it's just you're not used to hearing it in that way necessarily, in the way that you're used to hearing bitch. Mm-hmm. But there was a really interesting article I read somewhere about the use of animal words to, refer to women derogatorily, and that there are fewer for men. If you think about it, how often are we, to a certain degree, are we really using the same kind of comparing men to animals in the way that we compare women to animals? For me, I think heifer is funny, but it's a personal relationship because my grandmother used to say it a lot. And, it just, when I was writing that, I was just yes, this is, to me, I was just chuckling a little bit because I just thought it was funny. But I can appreciate your response is different.
Well, it's baffling more than anything, right? I wasn't actually upset, but I was just so disconcerted. And maybe it is just, satiation. I don't hear it used like that. And so it was surprising. But in a lot of the moments where it's used, or at least several that I can think of, it is affectionately between Clara and Zelda. So it was not that upsetting. I was just why does this put me on edge? It doesn't make sense.
It's the same tone. If you call your friend a bitch, come on, bitch. But if you're actually calling somebody a bitch, then you can change the tone. And it's the same kind of thing. I can imagine if they're really, if they're talking about these other women in town that they just hated, that it's a different energy.
Yeah, and that energy definitely came across. It was not upsetting because I thought these friends were being mean to each other.
Right.
I don't know. People have weird reactions to stuff that you don't expect.
Yeah. and trying to like incorporate some of the 1920s language in there, but not too much, because there's some really crazy slang that I researched. I'm like, oh, no one's going to know what I'm talking about. So let me just try to, use slang with enough context clues. And I mean, I think that word people still understand, but like, yeah. 20s language can be really cool and fun, but there are some things where you're like, ooh, it's also, there are some really disturbing slang too that could be used.
Do you have a favorite 1920s slang word, whether or not it was used in the book?
I don't think so. I loved, there's one, at one point, Israel talks about juking in a gut bucket, which I think is funny. Like all the different words for types of music and the places where you go to listen to music. I thought that was kind of funny.
I think highfalutin and addlepated are very underutilized words, and I loved them so much. Everyone should use them every day.
That's another favorite of mine. Discombobulated, which I think is just a real word but people don't use enough. But addlepated, yeah, that's a good one.
Highfalutin. It's very rare. Like I can think of times when I've wanted that exact word, but it just hadn't come to me. Now I know it's highfalutin and it's perfect.
It just rolls off the tongue. It's got like a rhythm to it too.
Thank you so much for coming on. Before we give you back your afternoon, is there anything, you've talked a little bit about your current project, but is there anything else you can tell us? And then also, where can our listeners find you on the internet?
Well, I've got 2 current works in progress. I'm working on book 2 of the Bliss Wars series, which is called Beastly Kingdom, which is a futuristic paranormal romance kind of thing with shifters and dragons and things. And I'm also working on another historical fantasy that I don't have a title approved yet to share, but I'm calling it the Black Towns book. That is what I call it on my podcast. And it's about an all-Black town in the South, which is being threatened by the construction of a new dam, which is going to flood it. And there's a magical solution. There's like a magical stranger comes to town that has a solution for this problem. So I'm having lots of fun writing that. And that's like a 2024 book. And as for where you can find me, I am at lpenelope.com. You can also find my podcast at myimaginaryfriends.net. And yeah, thanks for having me. It's been so amazing to talk to both of you.
Thank you so much. This has been a blast. I know it's not an upcoming project, but would you tell us a little bit about Savage City, your self-published book?
Sure. Yeah. So Savage City, it is a book that I worked on for many years, but it is the first in the Bliss Wars. So I'm working on book 2. And the first one is a portal fantasy. So it's a young woman who gets taken from our world, thrown into this alternate version of San Francisco, which is teeming with shifters and these warring clans of shifters. And she's mistaken for the princess of one of the clans because she looks identical to her. And she takes her place. She pretends to be the princess in order to survive and has to navigate this, this new world, these shifters, and falling in love with someone who is completely forbidden to her. So it's my futuristic fantasy paranormal romance portal. It's a mashup of things, but I think it's a lot of fun. I really love it. And it's going to be a trilogy. So 2 more books in the works.
And is it ebook or also physical copies?
It's ebook, print, and audio. So whatever format that you would like. But yeah, it should be available at all online retailers.
I'm very excited. That was purely selfish of me, just asking you to hype me up for this book. So thank you for indulging that.
It sounds excellent. I want to go check it out.
Thanks. Yeah, cool.
And thank you again for spending this time with us and talking a little bit about the Monsters We Defy. It came out a couple months ago. Did it come out in November?
August.
All right. Well, anyone who hasn't read it yet ought to, and then come back and listen to the spoiler section.
Get all the behind the scenes. And thank you guys again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We're on Twitter and Instagram at FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And follow us wherever your podcasts live.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye.
Bye.